Welcome back to Chess Dog. Today we have a game between Hikaru Nakamura and Alireza Firouzja. This was played at the St. Louis Rapid, which followed the main classical event of the Sinkfield Cup, which was won by Alireza on a tiebreak against Nepomniachtchi. And here we see really one of, if not the best, rapid players in the world, maybe only second to Carlsen, in Hikaru Nakamura, going up against Alireza Firouzja. Two heavy hitters. This is going to be a good game. Let's check it out. Hikaru Nakamura has white. Firouzja has black. Knight to f3 is what Nakamura starts with. d5 and e3. And what Naka is going to try to do here is basically play a ready, but control the d4 square, so Alireza Firouzja cannot play d4 himself. Knight f6, c4, e6, and b3. So now he's got a ready formation, but white can't, or black, excuse me, can't play d4 here. Bishop to e7. Firouzja says, yeah, okay, whatever. I'm just going to play a Queen's Gambit decline structure, just play it real orthodox like. Bishop to b2, castles. And the main move here is bishop to e2, but Nakamura plays g3. Now, it looks like he's weakening all of these light squares, and he is. The problem is black has a hard time really taking advantage of that, and he wants to play bishop to g2, so Firouzja just matches him. He fianchettos his opposite bishop to sort of challenge Naka's bishop. Castle and c5, gaining space in the center, and queen to e2. White might consider taking on d5 and playing d4 after maybe playing rook to d1. That's a standard idea. And here it's not uncommon for black to play queen to c7. Firouzja didn't play that. Maybe he was worried about knight to c3, knight to b5 hitting the queen. I think black's probably fine after that anyway. But instead of that, he plays the move queen to c8. And that clears the room for the rook, but doesn't make the queen vulnerable to a knight jump later in the game. Knight goes to c3, rook to d8, rook a to c1. Naka puts his rook opposite Firouzja's queen. Makes sense. Knight to c6. He wants to play this d4 move. That's his key idea here. He's going to do what he can to play it. Now here, it might look like a good idea for white to go ahead and take on d5, and after knight d5, play d4. But there's a problem with this move, and it's bishop to a6, another reason why queen to c8 was a strong idea. That skewers the queen and the rook. White can play knight to b5 and interpose, but black is better at this point. It becomes a bit of a mess. So instead of doing all of that, Nakamura just goes ahead and plays d3, a more circumspect move, but it allows d4. This is the move Firouzja wanted to play from the beginning. It's the move Naka wanted him to not be able to play, but now he does get to play it. Takes a couple of times on d4, exchanges light squared bishops, cd4, and the knight, it could go to b5, but instead he goes to b1. And here we have our middle game structure. And essentially what it is, it's a modern Benoni, but with colors reversed. Nakamura gets this queenside pawn majority, and Firouzja gets a central pawn majority. They both want to advance their pawns. And in this position, black usually has only one main plan, and that is to play e5 and e4 after sufficient preparation has been made. It takes some preparation, but if black can play it, it's very powerful. It takes quite a while here, but Firouzja is determined, just like he was with d4 a little bit earlier in the game. Queen to b7 check, king to g1, and now h5, a novelty and a very creative idea. More standard approaches would be something like bishop c5, with the idea of rook to e8 and advancing that pawn. The idea here with h5 is to play h4 and then h3, and then, mate threats develop on g2. It becomes uncomfortable for the white king. So a strong idea. Knight to d2 and now h4. And since Naka does not want that pawn to end up on h3, he goes ahead and takes it. He's actually gained a pawn, but he has three very weak pawns now, and his king is vulnerable, much more vulnerable than it was before. Rook to c8, preparing a powerful rook lift. Rook to c5 and rook over somewhere on the king's side, wherever it's valuable. Queen to f3, offering the exchange of queens to relieve the pressure since his king is more vulnerable, but Firouzja says, nope, not doing that. If your king's vulnerable, I want to keep queens on the board, of course. King to h1 is played with the idea of rook to g1, attacking g7. Computers recommend this crazy move, rook to c2, which looks pointless. The idea is to play the bishop to c1 and eventually come over here. Human beings really don't play like that unless they know before the game what to do. Rook to c5, continuing that rook lift plan. Rook to g1, putting it on the half-open file. Rook to f5, hits the queen. and behind her, the f2 pawn. The queen goes to g2, threatening mate at the moment, but knight to h5, defends the g7 pawn, attacks the h4 pawn with the bishop, and later the knight could hop even into f4 once g7 is sufficiently protected and would be very well placed. And now Naka finally begins to advance his queenside majority, and we see how far behind white is in his counterplay in this position. Bishop takes h4, also attacks the f2 pawn. The rook moves to defend the f2 pawn, and now g6. And so the g7 pawn doesn't have to be defended, and this knight on h5 can move and become more active. Knight to e4, the bishop retreats to e7, and now knight to g3. Naka does not want that knight jumping into f4, but all possible. And here Firouzja decides to exchange the knight, but it's very, very important that Nakamura takes that knight the right way. If he, say, takes with the h-pawn, then rook to h5 check, and the only way to get out of check is to block with the queen, and you lose decisive material. He could take with the queen, but that leaves the pawn weaknesses. And after, say, queen b7 check, queen g2, rook to f3, black can play king g7, rook h8, and get a real bind on the position. This is not what Nakamura wants. So he takes with the correct pawn, the f pawn. Now, bishop g5 is not a bad idea. The bishop can go to e6, but instead Firouzja plays b5. This is also a thematic idea in Benoni's. It's kind of a defensive idea. You're basically using a minority attack against white's strong queenside pawns. And if pawn takes, queen takes, and it's a double attack on b3 and d3. Instead, Nakamura plays g4, forcing the rook to make a decision. The rook exchanges on f1, and now pawn takes, and you don't want to take with the d pawn. Now this pawn would be passed, so white has to take with the b pawn, and now we see why b5 is a strong idea. This once very beautiful pawn chain has now been broken up, and white has 3 pawn islands to black's 2. So the pawn structure for black is definitely better now. Finally, e5 is played. We talked about how that was the primary goal for black in this structure. It took a while, but finally e5, preparing to advance those central pawns, has been played. He still has the idea of bishop g5, bishop to e3. So Nakamura battles that. He says bishop to c1. I don't want your bishop coming to g5. Rook to b8. Firouzja grabs the only open file. Queen to f3. This attacks f7, but it actually is a mistake. And the reason it is a mistake is because of Firouzja's next move. He plays queen to b7. And this pins the queen to the king and forces the queens off of the board. Now, why would he do that now when he wasn't doing it before? Because now the endgame is very strong for black. He has a healthier pawn structure, as we've already noted. He has more space, and he has control of the open b file. He also has easier targets, such as this a3 pawn, to attack. So black is better after this move. King to g2, take, rook to b1. Firouzja pins the bishop at c1 to the rook. The king goes to e2 to defend the rook. And now, boom, f5. Only now, after all this time, the central pawns finally begin to roll forward. Pawn takes, and obviously the rook can't take on f5 because he would lose his bishop. The king goes to d2. Now the pawn is being attacked. And the strongest move here is probably f4, which just puts an end to that direct attack on the pawn. Firouzja plays bishop takes a3 because the bishop at c1 is pinned, and that is an issue. But here's a very key moment. Nakamura plays c5. Now, in this position, it would be a terrible blunder for Firouzja to take on c1. It looks like he might be entering a winning king and pawn endgame, but actually would be losing. Because after exchanges on c1, king f7, this pawn advances. But now that this pawn is about to be captured, the h-pawn would move. And Firouzja would not be able to stop both pawns. And you see the black king is outside of the square of the pawn. The pawn could not be stopped. So that would be a mistake. The best move here is king to f7, believe it or not. Rook to f5 check, king to e6, rook f1, bishop c5. And if you look at this position, we get the exact same position we get in the game, but the king is on e6. Firouzja takes the pawn immediately with the bishop, and then rook takes f5. Now it's the same position, except this king is on g8. And Nakamura has fought back to some equality here, so Firouzja has to fight again, bishop to d6 to defend that pawn. King to c2, hits the rook, rook to b7, h4, rook to c7, check, and here's a key moment from Nakamura. The right decision, the right way to move the king is to b1. It doesn't look like the right move. You're moving away from the center, but it's the better move. Look at this variation. Rook to c3, rook to f3 to defend the pawn, and now e4. There's a pin here, but what white would do is play rook to f6, right? Counterattacking the bishop, say bishop e7, then rook to e6, you hit the bishop, attack the e4 pawn. Well, king to d1 is what was played in the game. Now let's look at that same variation here after rook c3, rook to f3, e4, rook to f6. Now rook to d3 is with check, and that would make all the difference. So after rook to c3, Nakamura can't play rook f3. He plays rook to f6, counterattacking the bishop. The bishop goes to a3, offering the exchange of bishops. The right plan here is bishop to f8, it turns out. The bishop on g7 is quite strong, defending the pawns and limiting the h-pawn. But bishop to a3 is played. Computers show this computer-like solution for white. Bishop to d2, offering the d3 pawn. Then after king c2, rook to h3, rook to e6, and it turns out white is actually in position to stop black's pawn mass and would have equalized. But instead, bishop to g5 was played by Nakamura. Rook takes d3 check, king to e2, rook to h3, rook behind the pawn. And here, rook to g6 was played. If he plays rook to e6, then d3 check, king f2, rook h2, and when the king moves, rook to e2. And Firouzja is holding his central pawns and is easily winning this endgame. So instead, Nakamura plays rook to g6 check, king goes to f7, rook to f6 check, king back to g7, king to f2, and bishop to e7. And in this position, Nakamura resigned, and the reason is this. Rook to e6, which makes sense. He's attacking the pawn and the bishop. Then bishop takes g5, hg5, but then rook e3. And because Firouzja would be able to keep this central pawn mass, there's simply no way white can stop him, and Nakamura did resign. Now, even after going over this great game from Firouzja, there is still some great chess you're missing out on. To fix that problem, believe it or not, the key game you're going to want to look at is in this video right here. So make sure to check that out next for some really terrific chess.